Hello everybody and welcome to the LRN chart show. Today we look at the F1 grid and who are the top 10 performers from the last two races. So we're ranking them, the top 10, based on the performances in Mexico and Austin, and I will be basing it on the performances as drivers and removing the element of the performance that is down to the machinery in which they are driving. So trying my best to focus on their performances versus their teammates, the teams that they're competing with around them, and generally where you'd expect them to finish versus where they do. And again, trying to remove the element of it that is, for example, Verstappen's in a Red Bull, therefore he will be at the front. What has he done to actually give him the win? Is it just a machinery? What has he done personally to outperform the car? Of course, we look at in his example how he performs against Perez, etc. So let's get into it then. We're going to kick straight off at number 10, and that is Daniel Ricciardo. And I felt like this was probably the easiest choice in terms of the top 10. I think there was a lot of, when I was researching this video, a lot of discussion in my head around who would go where and why. And I think, there's a few drivers you could put in different places, but I think with Danny Rick, you look at his performance in Austin, it was really bad. Probably the worst driver in Austin. If we're being fair, I think, he qualified. Look at the machinery, of course. Qualified P16, finished P16, just had an absolute nothing race. Arguably one of his worst races, not just of the year, but maybe even of his career, other than the extremes. And it certainly just wasn't the best day for Ricciardo. I think that he could firmly be held as either the worst or worst driver on the grid that particular day. But then he followed that up with a driver of the day performance in Mexico, and what a drive it was. The first half of the race didn't seem to be the most spectacular, but I think we didn't really understand just how good a stint he was putting in on those medium tyres, of course running to lap 44, so that he could put the softs on and put that absolute charge through the field on towards the end of the race. And that isn't something Ricciardo would have done, even if he had the exact same strategy in other races or similar strategy. You don't feel like that performance would have been there. Even on the fresher tyres, you just wouldn't think that he'd find his way through the field, but he did. In Mexico, he absolutely smashed it. It was so good to see him flying through the field. And yes, he had the incident with Tsunoda, obviously putting Tsunoda out the race, giving a 10-second penalty to Daniel Ricciardo. But for me, the recovery drive, the performance of him to fly through the field, finish in P7, given his struggles this season in that car, and to really outperform Lando Norris on the day as well, as I say, puts him in at number 10. And because it's based on a mixture of both the Austin GP and the Mexico GP, I think going from the worst to the best, for me, in at number 10, Daniel Ricciardo. Moving on then to Charles Leclerc. So in Austin, he had a really good race, really strong performance from Leclerc. Again, you look across the weekend, he was the strongest performer, it looked like, going into qualifying. Of course, he ended up being out-qualified by his teammate Carlos Sainz, though you do feel the pace was there for Charles Leclerc to get the pole position. Of course, he did end up with an engine penalty, which meant he started down in 12th, but he did then recover in that drive to finish in P3. He was running in P2, but he couldn't quite hold off Verstappen, so he ended up in P3. But given that, the Ferraris are arguably the third quickest car on the grid at the moment, I know how good they were in one lap trim in Austin, but we also saw how well Hamilton performed in Austin as an example. So for him to finish in P3, to have such a strong day in qualifying, to be strong all weekend, for me, really, really up there in terms of his performance during the Austin weekend. And then in Mexico, it's certainly not as good, not to that level. Quite poor, to be honest, from not just Leclerc's perspective, but from Ferrari's perspective. Qualified in P7, so had the Alfa Romeo of Bottas in front of him. So to qualify behind a customer team like Alfa Romeo, not a great thing for Leclerc. And then he finished the race 10 seconds behind his teammate in 6th. So let's say, not the best day for Leclerc in Mexico. And again, looking at the machinery, I think it was quite a poor day for him. So he would have been well outside the top 10 drivers in Mexico for me. And so on the balance of performance, I've got him down in 9th. at the moment. As I say, you could move them around a little bit, but for me, when we go through the other drivers, I think they're slightly more deserving to be higher up the grid. You may disagree, so let me know in the comments who you think, who ranks where, what you agree with, what you disagree with, and who maybe your top three would be. But we'll get into the next one then. So in at number 8, we have George Russell. So George Russell qualified in 4th in Austin, finishing in 5th, but he was 40 seconds behind his teammate Lewis Hamilton. Of course, we know finished 2nd in Austin, so we know how consistent George has been this season. But certainly at the moment, he's just being outshined by Lewis Hamilton, a resurgent Hamilton who has been on some of his best form, I think, in the last few races. So that's nothing against Russell, but you look at the deficit that he had to his teammate, and in what we know now is really strong machinery. We know it isn't really truly touching the Red Bulls in terms of outright pace, but that Mercedes is really quick now, and they've definitely got on top of the issues they had earlier in the season. And I just think that given that Lewis has moved past George at the moment, and I think, again, given the machinery, I think he could have, maybe not in terms of position, but a 40-second deficit to Hamilton is huge, and he definitely gets marked down for that in his performance in Austin. And then Mexico, of course, he stepped up. So we know that he ended up finishing qualifying P2 behind Verstappen. So it was a massive performance. But as we know, he lost that position to Hamilton in the first 2 corners, and then from there, he also lost out to Sergio Perez. Too hesitant to hold him off. And then we, of course, he came home ahead of the Ferraris in the end. So, given that the car seemed to be clearly a stronger, bit of kit than the Ferraris on that day, he didn't really outperform the car. He didn't really do enough, I think, to push him up the order in terms of his rankings. I think when you take his machinery into account, has he truly outperformed the car? Has he done anything spectacular across those 2 races? I think no. I think he's been consistent. I think he's finished in good positions, and I can't fault him for that. I say coming home in 5th, and then coming home in 4th in Mexico means that absolutely he's got to be considered up there as one of the strongest drivers across the 2 races, and that's why I've got him in 8th. But certainly I don't think you can put him any higher than that. I don't think he did any more than what the car was giving him. I don't think he did anything spectacular. So for me, Russell is in 8th. Moving on then, we go to Valtteri Bottas, and for me, yes, he had an issue in Austin. Of course, he had a crash, which he's taken the fault for. But he did have a massive tailwind that basically unsettled the car. But again, he's taken the blame for that. But I think when you look at the Austin weekend as a whole, he qualified in P7, which is a brilliant qualifying performance for him. Something that he's been pretty consistent with in terms of his qualifying performances. Across the weekend, before, of course, the incident, he looked strong. He's continued to look strong in the Alfa Romeo. And then into Mexico, he qualified P6, so another step up. He split the Ferraris in Mexico, which I think is a massive performance. And yes, the pace of the car didn't allow him to hang on to that position, so he did fall down the order, and he came home in 10th, and he brought home a point. But when you look at the difference, he was a second quicker in qualifying than Zhou Guanyu, which is a massive, massive deficit for Zhou to Bottas in the same machinery. So I don't think it can be understated what level of performance Bottas is putting in to that Alfa Romeo at the moment. And yes, as I say, he had the incident, but given his just outright pace, the way that he's outperforming the car, the way that he's outperforming his teammate, I think he really is in strong form at the moment. And assuming that he doesn't go and have another incident like he did in Austin in the race, going forward to Brazil, I would look to him again. He's going to be there or thereabouts in qualifying. And hopefully then he can go and have a strong race. But in terms of form, I think he really is up there. And I hope that he can then carry that on into the next 2 races, because it's just good to see him enjoying himself and doing well and rebuilding his brand and his name following, of course, the years playing second fiddle to Hamilton at Mercedes. So well done, Bottas. But I think those qualifying performances alone were fantastic. And it really is important to note that that is just massively outperforming the pace that the Alfa Romeo actually has. So brilliant drives there from Bottas. So that puts him up in 7th. Of course, he could have been higher had he not had the incident in Austin. Up then in 6th, we have Alex Albon, and another one where we have to take the machinery out of the equation here. Albon has had really strong performances, and again, you just have to just judge him against his teammate. So in Austin, he ended up starting in the top 10. So he started 9th after qualifying 12th. Of course, with penalties to people around him. So he ended up starting 9th in Austin, which is a fantastic starting place for Williams at any stage of the season. And then he did genuinely remain competitive for a lot of the race against cars that genuinely are just faster than the Williams, but he did eventually fall down to P12. But I don't think you can fault him for that. We know that the Williams is one of the slowest cars on the grid. So for him to keep that fight, keep that momentum, keep that pace, and still end up in a really respectable position in Austin and really massively outperform his teammate, I don't think there's any question of how well he's doing in that Williams. And I do hope that he gets another opportunity, whether it be with Williams or with someone else in the future, to show what he can do in a car that's performing. And I do hope for Williams' sake that it can end up being Williams. And it'll be interesting to see how Logan Sargent gets on when well, assuming he does get the second seat now that Latifi's moving on. Hopefully he can then help Williams again build on the progress that they're making at the moment. But then, of course, Albon in Mexico, again, taking the machinery into account. So he's qualified 17th, so not as good a performance as what we had in Austin, but he's still 3/10 ahead of Latifi. So again, still a massive performance there from Albon. And he managed to get ahead of the Aston Martins and of the Alfa Romeo of Zhou Guanyu during the race day and finish in P12 and only 2 seconds off of Pierre Gasly, which again is massive performance. This is a Williams that is not strong in terms of its performance as an entity, so you cannot knock him down for the fact that he's not finishing in the points. I think the actual drive that Albon is doing in that car, given its level of performance, is nothing short of brilliant. So he absolutely is deserving of a place on this list, and for me, 6th place for Alex Albon based on the previous 2 races. Next up, and definitely Austin being the one that is going to get this man into this position, is Sebastian Vettel in at number 5, and we all know the drive that he put in. His heroics, his overtaking against Kevin Magnussen on the final lap in Austin. Of course, that's what we remember, but his drive overall was really strong. Even though he qualified behind Lance Stroll, we know that obviously Lance Stroll had his incident with Fernando Alonso, but Vettel went on. Even though he dropped way down the order, he managed to make up loads of positions and come home in P7. So really strong performance for Vettel in Austin. And then in Mexico, he qualified P16, which doesn't sound amazing, but we need context that in Mexico the Aston Martins were really struggling. I think it was the altitude. Of course, it's the highest altitude race of any race of the season, and the Aston Martins seem to struggle more than others during the Mexico GP weekend, but he still qualified 4 places ahead of his teammate Lance Stroll, and it wasn't anything to write home about. But he did everything that he could do in that car. I don't think there was any suggestion that there was more performance to give in the Aston Martin across the Mexico GP weekend. So really, still decent performance there from Vettel. And you couple that with his driver of the day performance in Austin, and for me, he's up there in P5. In P4 then, and I think this one is about consistency. So this one is Lando Norris. So Lando Norris coming in at P4. And I think where other drivers have maybe had like one really good race and then one where they've as being not finished or had issues or just not performed, like Ricciardo as an example. Norris hasn't had a really outstanding performance, I don't think, although maybe we're just really used to how good he is, that we don't really, it started to become numb to the fact that he's just absolutely been awesome in the McLaren. But I don't think he had either of these races were his best by any stretch of the imagination, but certainly they were both good, strong performances, and he continues to deliver in a McLaren that is, to be fair, it's struggling, and it isn't the fastest car on the grid. It is definitely fallen behind Alpine in the pecking order of general pace. Even if he is good at getting a one lap performance out of it on the Saturday, which kind of gives him an opportunity on the Sunday, but we see on basic pace, and unless things happen like Alonso, of course, not finishing the Mexico GP, generally speaking, Norris will be there or thereabouts, but the McLaren, of course, it just isn't where you'd hope it would be in that at this stage of the season. I don't think the upgrades have been a massive gain for McLaren, and they'll certainly be hoping to go into next season with a better car than the one that they've had this year. But Norris, of course, comfortably outperforming Daniel Ricciardo in Austin. We know how bad a performance that he had there. So he ended up getting into the top 10 because in terms of qualifying, because Zhou Guanyu had his time deleted, and then went on to have a really good race, clawing his way back into the points after being hampered right at the beginning. He got caught up in the incident between Russell and Sainz, so he had to fight his way back through, which he did, and he had a strong performance in Austin. As I say, when you compare him to his teammate, really good performance. We had Ricciardo start and finish in 16th, so to start in the top 10 and then finish in the points was a massive improvement on what we saw Ricciardo deliver. So really strong performance from that perspective from Norris. And then in Mexico, started up in 8th on the grid and then ran in 10th for most of the race, and then came home in 9th for a couple of points. Up in P3 then we have Fernando Alonso, and I think he's another one who you could look at it and you could say, look, he didn't even finish the race in Mexico. But I think you look at him as a driver, his performances, it's not his fault that his engine gave out. And certainly, again, look at Austin. I think his performance was brilliant. He did nothing wrong in the overtaking maneuver on Lance Stroll that nearly took him out of the race. And then with that slightly damaged car, it was, of course, could have been much worse, but it was, generally speaking, the car was pretty sound. I think he had some damage to the front wing, but he managed, despite that incident with Stroll right at the beginning of the race, to come all the way back through by the end and finish in P7. So I think that was a fantastic drive from Alonso, controlling, of course, what essentially was a wheelie in his Formula One car before, and avoiding the wall after the collision with Lance Stroll. So that on its own was fantastic. And then, of course, going on to finish in the points despite having that incident, I just think was absolutely brilliant of Fernando Alonso. And again, to come home in 7th was brilliant. Of course, he kept that position after all of the issues with the FIA and appealing decisions of the 30-second penalty. He did end up keeping his 7th place, so he stayed in the points, and what a brilliant drive and deserving drive of that 7th place it was. And then in Mexico, again, qualifying in 9th, he qualified ahead of his teammate Esteban Ocon. And if he was definitely in contention, right? If he'd stayed in the race, if he hadn't had the engine issues, which were hampering his pace as well, you have to think he'd have been up there. He'd have been fighting probably with Daniel Ricciardo for one of those two to finish ahead. And obviously, given the penalty, I do think that Ricciardo had, I do think that Alonso would have gone and finished 7th. So it would have been two incredibly strong performances for Alonso, and probably would have seen him maybe even further up the list, though maybe not, given the performance of the top two. But certainly, I think Alonso, on his form, is certainly worthy of a 3rd place. I mean, other than the car failing him, he just continues to deliver. Age is just a number with Alonso. He's just been absolutely phenomenal. And yes, there have been moments this season where he struggled, but across the last 2 races, I don't think there's any question that he's one of the most consistent drivers on the grid, one of the quickest drivers on the grid, and fully deserving of a 3rd place on this top 10 ranking. Now into the top 2 then, and I have to be honest, it was really hard to decide which way round to put these drivers. But at number 2, we are going to go with Lewis Hamilton. So I'm sure immediately you can guess who number 1 is going to be. But with Hamilton then, we know in Austin, for him to come home in 2nd place and to lead some of that race, which I know he was absolutely ecstatic about, that he finally got to lead some races. We, of course, know some of that was down to the fact that Verstappen had a slow pit stop. That's down to Verstappen's engineers. But he put on a good performance. He made the race worth watching in terms of the race at the front. He added some excitement. He gave us something, maybe someone else other than Verstappen would win. Maybe we'd finally see or the dominance of Verstappen broken over the last few races, of course, that we've seen. But of course, it wasn't to be. Hamilton couldn't quite hold on to that first place. But again, you look at the machinery, you look at the fact that he finished 40 seconds ahead of his teammate George Russell. Whatever way you look at it, the performance was awesome. The reason he didn't win is because he doesn't have a car quick enough to win. It has nothing to do with his performance as a driver. He gave it everything he possibly could. And again, that is proven by how far ahead of his teammate that he finished. That's my perspective on it. So it's nothing. Yes, okay, the fact that he's in the Mercedes, that does, of course, drive him up and put him in a position where he can be in this conversation. But when you compare him and you look at his qualifying, you look at the fact of how far he's ahead of his teammate, etc., I think that warrants his place up near the very top of this list as the main driver, actually taking the fight to Max Verstappen at the moment towards the end of this season. So certainly in Austin, he showed that. And then again, of course, in Mexico, he was top of Q1 and Q2 in qualifying. He missed out in Q3. He had engine issues that meant he couldn't go for a pole lap, and of course started in third place. But he managed to get up to P2 in the first two corners after overtaking George Russell. The strategy, of course, ended up costing Mercedes massively. We do think that maybe if Mercedes had run the medium to soft strategy that we saw, the soft to medium strategy that we saw Red Bull use, that maybe would have seen a more competitive race. But we know the Red Bulls are faster, and the chances are, given that if they were on the exact same strategy, I just don't see how Lewis really could have beaten Max in Mexico. I just don't think the car's there to do it. But he did nothing wrong. He got the move done at the beginning. He was strong all weekend. He probably would have been on pole position had he not had the engine issues. And don't forget, he had engine issues during the race as well. So to finish where he did, to see it out, of course, using all the experience that Lewis has, I don't think there's any question that he was going to be in the top two of this list. But that does mean that we have only one person it could be in terms of the number one, and that is, of course, Max Verstappen. So Max Verstappen is the number one driver in terms of form, and I don't think anyone can really question it. Even if you do think someone else has outperformed him and you start taking everything into account, if you say that anyone is going to win in Brazil other than Max, you're probably wrong. His performances are strong. Perez isn't even on this list because of how quick Max has been. When you compare Perez's performance and how much he struggles to overtake and keep up with whether it be the Ferraris or the Mercedes or whatever's going on that race, Perez is kind of fighting tooth and nail to just try and get that that second place finish behind Max. Whereas with Max, it just seems so easy, so simple, he's just so at the top of his game. That when you go into the race, it's a question of, in my mind at least, it's how is Max going to win? If he doesn't qualify first, when's he going to get to the first and then see out the rest of this race? And the engine seems absolutely bulletproof. He doesn't seem to be having any issues whatsoever. We know he's already the champion. And I just can't give it to anybody else. I think he's just been so consistent. We know he didn't take pole position in Austin, and that, of course, went to Carlos Sainz. Sainz, of course, having the incident at the beginning, and then he, of course, went on to have the battle with Hamilton in Austin, which eventually led to Verstappen winning. And then again in Mexico, he went and broke Schumacher's record with a 14th win of the season. And he didn't put a single foot wrong. It's really hard to judge how he drove in Mexico because he was so good. He was just out in front. He was just doing what he needed to do. He was keeping the gap. He didn't do anything wrong. We had a bit of back and forth on the radio, and it was just easy for him. At least it feels easy. Of course, we know that isn't the case. We know that there's an incredible amount of talent and speed that goes into Verstappen's performances to make it look as easy as he's making it look. And again, you only have to look at Perez to understand that if he wasn't the talent that he is, he wouldn't have these performances. We wouldn't be talking about how easy it is. It isn't just the car. So absolutely worthy of a number one position in this rankings. He's done nothing but prove just how good he is in this Red Bull in both Austin and Mexico and all of the races prior. As I say, 14 race wins this season, and even not taking 12 of those into account, he's still the number one driver on form in Formula One. I don't think there's any question about that. Hamilton, of course, running him really close. I think Hamilton has done a phenomenal job just to be in the conversation in terms of race wins in the last two races. But there's no question about it. For me, Max Verstappen, number one at the moment on form based on his performances in Austin and Mexico. Let me know in the comments though, do you agree with that? Would you have someone else in number one? Do you think, again, taking machinery out of the conversation, is there someone else who you think is more deserving of a number one place on this list? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, I'm just going to thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day. Don't forget to hit a like on the video if you did enjoy it. Goodbye.